All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Cosa Nostra. We're going to separate all those romanticized Hollywood myths, the glamorous mobsters and cinematic tropes, from the brutal, complex, and honestly terrifying historical reality of the mafia.
So, before we go anywhere, we've got to get two foundational terms straight. First is Cosa Nostra, which literally translates to our thing. Now, this isn't just a generic catch-all term for organized crime. It specifically refers to the structured criminal society originating in Sicily. And alongside it is Omertà, that strict, unforgiving code of silence and absolute loyalty. These men of honor lived, killed, and died by this exact cultural vocabulary. It's what completely separated them from ordinary street criminals.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Origins in Sicily. 2. The American expansion. 3. Wars and crackdowns. And 4. The Mafia today.
Section 1. Origins in Sicily, the power vacuum. It was a perfect storm of instability that actually created the mafia. The real turning point hits right around 1860 to 1861. The overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy during Italy's unification left rural Sicily almost entirely lawless. It created this massive power vacuum. Absentee landlords who were absolutely terrified of bandits were suddenly forced to hire local enforcers. Now, the term mafia actually started out as a Sicilian word for swagger or fearlessness, but by 1865 it had officially gained its criminal association. And by the late 19th century, well, they weren't just protecting estates anymore. They were actively infiltrating local politics and elections, very often with the total complicity of the ruling elite. Which brings us to an absolutely crucial theme. The mafia didn't just emerge as random, chaotic villains. They actually acted as a vicious substitute for law and order in a deeply distrustful society. Because think about it, when the central government is incredibly weak, people still need contracts enforced, they still need their property protected, and they still need disputes settled. The early mafia provided that trust, albeit, at the end of a gun. Before they were the massive global syndicates we think of today, they were simply local, autonomous clans. They called them cosche. They operated essentially as localized cartels of protection providers. They'd shake down farmers and local businesses for the pizzo, which is just the traditional term for extortion or protection money, all while mediating local illegal agreements. It was a very local system, but it was incredibly effective. Section 2. The American expansion. Crossing the Atlantic. This expansion happened in some very clear, consequential steps. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, huge waves of Sicilian and southern Italian immigrants arrived in U.S. cities like New Orleans, New York, and Chicago. Facing severe poverty and just systemic discrimination, some of them brought these old world traditions with them, and that set the stage for the early Black Hand extortion gangs. But the ultimate catalyst arrived in 1920, Prohibition. Banning alcohol completely exploded bootlegging profits. It took local street-level enforcers and literally turned them into multimillionaires practically overnight. Now this is where the American Mafia distinctly diverges from its roots. Following a bloody internal conflict called the Castellamarese War in the early 1930s, Charles Lucky Luciano fundamentally transformed the American Mafia. He shifted it entirely away from the old Sicilian model, which was characterized by independent clans focused on territorial protection and just endless violent feuds. Instead, Luciano implemented the Five Families model in New York and established a national commission. Luciano practically turned the mafia into a Fortune 500 company. He prioritized board meetings and profit margins over petty blood feuds. During this American peak, the sheer scope of their influence was staggering. You had figures like Al Capone completely dominating Chicago. They were forming really lucrative, powerful alliances with Jewish syndicates like those run by Meyer Lansky. And post-World War II, they were infiltrating the very fabric of American labor unions and legitimate businesses. They operated in the shadows for decades, that is, right up until the infamous 1957 Appalachian meeting in upstate New York. This massive gathering of bosses was raided by local police, which sent dozens of ruthless mobsters fleeing clumsily through the upstate woods in their expensive tailored suits. The sheer embarrassment of that incident finally forced J. Edgar Hoover's FBI to actually acknowledge this coordinated national network. Section 3. Wars and Crackdowns. The Bloody Cost of Justice. Meanwhile, back in Sicily, the timeline of escalation was staggeringly violent. It kicked off with Mussolini's mass arrests in the 1920s, which, ironically, drove a lot of mafiosi to emigrate to the US in the first place. After World War II, the Sicilian Mafia revived and shifted heavily into the wildly lucrative heroin trade. This massive influx of cash sparked the 1980s Second Mafia War. This is where the hyper-violent Corleonese faction, led by Salvatore Toto Riina, seized absolute control. They slaughtered rivals and state officials alike, which forced heroes like Judge Giovanni Falcone to strike back with the massive 1986 Maxi Trial. But there was an unprecedented, bloody cost to that justice. While the Mafia trial was a monumental success, convicting hundreds of mobsters, thanks in part to informants actually breaking Omertà, Cosa Nostra retaliated with horrific brutality. In 1992, they carried out massive bombings that murdered both Judge Falcone and his colleague Paolo Borsellino. The public outrage was absolutely unprecedented, and it finally led to the 1993 arrest of the boss of bosses, Toto the Beast Riina. Back across the Atlantic, the American Mafia was facing its own structural collapse. The sacred code of silence was finally publicly broken by Joe Valachi's testimony in 1963. But the real game changer? That was the 1970 RICO Act. RICO literally changed everything. It gave the government the ability to prosecute leaders for crimes they ordered, not just the ones they physically committed with their own hands. This gave the FBI the exact tools they needed to slowly dismantle the American families, ultimately bringing down seemingly untouchable bosses like the Teflon Don, John Gotti. Section 4. The Mafia Today, Shadows of an Empire. So, in the 21st century, Cosa Nostra is kind of a shadow of its former self. Currently, estimates suggest there are roughly 5,500 active members operating in Sicily today. Now, they are absolutely still active in extortion, drugs, and corrupting public contracts, but they've been severely weakened. Decades of relentless arrests, massive asset seizures, and intense, brutal competition from other criminal groups, like the 'Ndrangheta from the Calabria region, have deeply eroded their once absolute dominance. And in the US, we're looking at just over 3,000 members and associates. Their footprint is much, much smaller now, mostly concentrated in the Northeast and Chicago. Facing overwhelming law enforcement pressure and heavy competition from other ethnic crime groups, they've had to adapt. They've largely stepped away from the spectacular street violence of the 20th century. Instead, they've shifted their focus to less visible enterprises. Think white-collar crimes, loan sharking, and highly lucrative illegal sports betting. Which leaves us with a fascinating and frankly chilling final thought to end this explainer. If we've learned anything at all from this history, it's that organized crime is very often an economic and social symptom of weak governance. So, as long as there are power vacuums, institutional distrust, and economic desperation, are we just doomed to watch a new version of this history repeat itself? It's a vital question to keep in mind as we look at global crime networks operating in the shadows today.